Hello again, everyone. We're back. Today, early South Asian societies, civilization or civilizations on the Indian subcontinent. So, ancient India is our subject matter for today. We'll start with the Harappan peoples, the Indus River civilization. Same thing in the Indus River Valley, which we see in the map in the upper right. And this was an agrarian empire, large-scale agriculture, centralized power, urban development, which we've already seen in other places, Mesopotamia, Egypt in particular, and we'll see lots of similarities between these agrarian empires, civilizations, which we already know some of the similarities. We've gone into it in a general sense already. But there's some distinctions, distinctiveness about what's happening in India about 5,000 to 4,000 years ago and beyond. The gift of the Indus, because this is another one of those civilizations that's based on a fertile river valley, very much dependent on it. Its wealth and power and success really come from the river, and from the river, large-scale agriculture, and from there, wealth, power, etc. The gift of the Indus is stolen from, of course, the more famous phrase, the gift of the Nile, but it applies because, again, they're similar in certain ways. But they're different in some ways, too. And one of the ways is that one of the major sculpting features, pardon my pun there, so you see a famous sculpture there, but one of the things that helped to create the unique, distinct culture of India was a large-scale migration. A group of Indo-Europeans known as the Aryans. Remember, the Indo-Europeans came from Central Asia, Ukraine, around the Caspian Sea, but they went in many directions. We've seen on maps before in earlier lectures, but one such group, the Aryans, makes their way to what's now India. And they run into the Dravidian peoples who were already there. The Dravidians had apparently migrated from across mountains further west than India today, but they'd been there for a long time. And the two clashed, but eventually kind of synthesized their cultures, and it's really that synthesis that led to what we now know as Indian culture, although it happened very gradually. Bentley and Ziegler, our lovable authors, say it's likely that Indo-European migrants clashed with Dravidians and other peoples already settled in India, but there's no indication that the Aryans conquered or destroyed the Harappan society. And this is all kind of cloudy still. There's a lack of evidence in a lot of important areas. Scholars disagree and aren't entirely sure. None of them are entirely sure whether Harappan society was sort of one of the Dravidian peoples or not. But either way, there's no evidence that the Aryans that came in did come in by force, at least with enough that it shows up in the record. Nonetheless, there is evidence that they stayed and eventually mingled with the Dravidians. So if they'd been enemies and fought war, a long time ago, they eventually put such conflicts aside. They go on to say, our authors, during the centuries after 1500 BCE, Dravidian and Indo-European peoples intermarried, interacted, and laid social and cultural foundations that would influence Indian society to the present day. Dravidian actually is first and foremost a linguistic term, one of the linguistic families. We talked about Indo-European languages, and this is another one. But it has some overlap into sort of culture as well. So to keep it simple for us, we're going to simplify the map on the left. Think of the invading newcomers, the Aryans, as sort of in the yellow, and the Dravidian peoples in the blue. Because right sort of the upper, or the left side, the west side of that blue little blotch there was the civilization on the Indus Valley, Indus River. So they're in conflict to some degree, as far as we know at first, but eventually sort of synthesize together, come together, and start intermarrying and become one people over a long period of time. The Aryans were a nomadic people, shepherds, and at first, and they had horses, they had chariots, so they might have been extremely difficult to deal with for the peoples living in India, the Dravidians and others, who didn't apparently have chariots at the time. So let's get back to the gift of the Indus, the Harappan culture, and its rather advanced agriculture. And we can see this is the foundation for their urban development, which, of course, was true in Mesopotamia, in Egypt. It's basically true everywhere that you see these processes happening. So we talked about that even in the very beginning of the class when we were looking at prehistory. Agriculture and urban development are always related. The farming doesn't always come first, but most of the time it does. So, as our author says again, the Indus made agricultural society possible in India. Unquote. Very simple, concise statement there. But again, without the agricultural underpinning and sophisticated, far-flung, large-scale agriculture, none of this is happening. The Harappan peoples grew wheat and barley. They had lots of domesticated animals, goats, sheep, cattle, chickens, and they produced so much agriculture that they had a surplus. Surpluses then allow craft specialization, which we've also talked about already. So that's when you can have experts, specialists, and that can spend their entire careers, lives, sort of doing one thing, not like hunter-gatherers who are jacks of all trades. They also cultivated cotton and in time built a cotton textile industry, which India would be famous for millennia afterwards. Michael Mann, an anthropologist, writing a book, brilliant book called The Sources of Social Power, really about world history, says the Indus settlements follow almost exactly the line of alluvial floodplain. The agricultural boost to civilization was nature's fertilizer, silt. That's true, by the way, of the Nile in Egypt. It was the silt that overflowed every year that sort of got into the soil, and it's what made it extra fertile. Settlement resulted once again in a population caged socially and territorially between the floodplain, and in this case, surrounding jungle mixed with waste scrub. So another similarity to Egypt, and that is that the people lived pretty close to the river on either side in a fairly narrow strip, wider than the Nile, but nonetheless they're kind of hemmed in by territory on the opposite sides of the Nile to go too far away from each bank, where it's really uninhabitable or far less habitable anyway. So scholars generally assume that the inhabitants did practice irrigation, but the rivers have obliterated almost all the evidence. The towns did use water channels for domestic use, and they were well protected from floods. So they probably had irrigation because of that, because they were doing those things in the towns. The Indus flooded unpredictably and sometimes violently. So this is unlike Egypt. We know, or should know, remember, that the Nile River flowed, or it overflowed, it flooded regularly, but pretty predictably. So the Egyptians could kind of predict, they could plan, they could prepare, and did. In this case, the unpredictability of the river, and they're entirely dependent on the river, is much like the Mesopotamians, who we already saw, had the same kind of thing happening to them on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the unpredictability of flooding. Which brings us to early complex urban development in India. And this is extremely complex. development organizationally, institutionally, technologically. There were two urban enclaves here, maybe even more, but two big ones. A city called Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, which you see on the upper left there. And these two cities were actually remarkable given how long ago we're talking about. They were probably in some ways like Sumerian city-states with no institutional above and beyond the city-state level. Remember, in Sumer there were 12 city-states, each of them independent. Once in a while they were conquered by another one, but overall independent. And so they didn't have, it wasn't a big kingdom. It wasn't an empire until Sargon later on, conquered the rest of them. But this is somewhat like that. There seems to have been what Michael Mann, again, calls the federal structure of the civilization, with at least two major cities, each of about 30 to 40,000 population. Considering how many thousands of years ago this is, 30 to 40,000 population is extraordinary. Without modern technology to be able to do all this, to get that many people living together relatively successfully is quite an achievement. It was surrounded by dozens or hundreds of other small settlements. There appears to have been internal hierarchy within the cities, but not sort of an overall pronounced hierarchy, which means, again, they didn't really answer to, it appears anyway, there's a lot of holes in the evidentiary record, but it appears they didn't answer to a higher power. That for instance, these two cities were independent of each other. So this is why by Michael Mann calls it a federal structure. Power is somewhat spread out. Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, one didn't answer to the other, or vice versa. So power was spread out between the city-states, but within the city-states and cities themselves, there was quite a bit of top-down hierarchical authority there. The regularity of town planning, the wealth of standardized weights and measures, and the dominance by a few central temples or palaces indicate a stronger city political authority, though not necessarily a state that could coerce its people. A bit fancier way of saying what I just did. The state might have had democratic features to it as well. That's, again, more up for debate and is debatable. We won't get into it. Urban and economic life in Harappan society, everything was extremely systematically organized. There were large marketplaces, a temple, usually right in the center of the city. That's like the Mesopotamian ziggurats too, at least the location right in the center. Large residential areas, neighborhoods, a grid system of streets. There's a sign of things being carefully, systematically planned, prepared, organized, carried out, executed. City walls, citadels, granaries. If ever played any of the civilization games, you know how important granaries are. It's actually true. Another textbook, not ours, but a more recent one, a new one, says the well-planned layout of Harappan cities and towns included a fortified citadel housing public facilities alongside a large residential area. The main street running through the city had covered drainage on both sides, with house gates on doors opening onto back alleys. Citadels were likely centers of political and ritual activity. The same author goes on to say the Harappans used brick extensively in upper-class houses, city walls, and underground water drainage systems. Workers used large ovens to manufacture the durable construction materials which the Harappans laid so skillfully that basic structures remain intact to this day. Another astonishing feature of all this. And if the cities look anything like the renditions of them here by artists, they were impressive indeed. We can, I think, easily underestimate all this because 30 to 40,000 for us today is a town. But without modern technology to, again, make all this work, 30 to 40,000 is actually a large-scale, society. As far as the economics of the Indus River civilization, Harappan civilization, we do see, as I already mentioned, craft specialization, cotton textile production, diversified system of manufacturers, pottery, goldsmiths, tool making, jewelers, various types of artists, extensive and distant trade. They traded as far away as Mesopotamia and Persia at one time or another. Copper, ivory, pottery, tools, and decorative items going out. Gold, silver, gems of various sorts, wool, leather, olive oil coming in. So, and you can see some of the more short-term trade within their own society happening there. So long-distance trade with Mesopotamia, Persia a little bit later on, shorter trade routes between resources and cities. You can see, if you really read that map, you don't have to, I'm not going to ask you specific questions, but you can see that like the bright yellow little dots, those and some of the other shapes are resources outside of the cities that are being shipped to the cities in return for other goods and items. So shorter trade routes than here, resources to cities, cities giving back manufactured goods, and the kind of things we saw above. Goods were taken to markets by boat or by ox cart. They're not going to Persia by ox cart, but again, in this regional trade within their own civilization, these are the transportation methods. They had rope to bind bales of goods together, seals to identify the owner. Apparently, they shipped things in these large terracotta boxes, and the seals become important because, as we'll see, it's how we know anything at all about how they had writing. It might have been the only thing they used for writing, but it's really all we have to show that they did have a writing system, though it hasn't even been deciphered yet. After all this time, we still don't know what it says. That'll be an interesting discovery. I'm sure it'll happen someday. I told you very early in the class that one of the interesting, exciting things about archaeology is there's still all kinds of mysteries unsolved that are remarkable ones. So there's all kinds of exciting finds unpredictably here or there. That would be an interesting one to find out. But seals to identify the owner, what that means is that when they put something in a terracotta, vessel or box, they and shipped it, they put a seal on it that not only sort of closed it, but it had writing on it, which had either the owner's name or information about what was inside. Again, we don't know because we can't read them, but it appears that it's possible then. I mean, there might have been other writing too that's lost to us, we haven't found or haven't found yet for other purposes, religious writings, such thing. But this, if it's the only writing, and we have the only writing they ever did, it would indicate then that at least in some places, maybe many or all places in the world, that writing was first inspired by the need to keep records for trade and for economic activity. Harappan society and culture, we'll just sort of talk about this briefly. As already mentioned, there were powerful city leaders. There seemed to be quite a hierarchy there, so large inequality. You can see this from tombs, burials. Remember that this is kind of a no-brainer for archaeologists, but when they find, as city, civilization, settlement, and a dig, if they find graves, and a few of them are extremely elaborate, with all kinds of riches and trinkets and gold and silver put in with the body, and then a mile away or less than that, there's a pit with bodies sort of dumped in it together in a mass grave. You can bet that there was inequality and hierarchy there. That person that got buried with all those items, taking them into the afterworld with them, or whatever the belief system was, is a clear sign that some people were considered more important than others. I'm not saying were more important, but considered to be more important. Certainly considered themselves to be more important. We alluded to the written language already It was about 400 symbols, from at least what we have, still undeciphered, mostly used on the outside of the trade containers. Again, fertility cults. They practiced a polytheistic religion, believed in gods and goddesses. Trees and animals were seen as sacred in their culture. And fertility cults have right. They're focused on sort of life and death and the cycle of life, and have religion kind of structured around it accordingly. Did some of their deities end up in Hindu religion? I ask with a question mark, because that's still debated as well, and we'll probably never know. But some scholars think there's a real possibility that some of the deities that are, the famous ones or even minor ones, Hindu religion, had roots all the way back to Harappan culture. Now we get to the Indo-European migrations and early Vedic India. So we kind of started with that. Now we're back to it again. So what Indo-European group is this? And where did they settle? The Aryans, sometimes called the Indo-Aryans. And they settled throughout most of India. Right? So question and answer. Doing a question and answer period here. Question. Okay, so who are the Aryans? Well, they were like an Indo-European group that was like totally nomadic, pastoral, and stuff like that. What does Aryan mean? Well, they were like we're these like noble people that are more important than everybody else. What did they do in India? Well, like some farming and stuff, but mostly like horses, keeping horses, cattle, sheep, goats, and junk like that. That's it. They also kind of spread all over India, maybe by sort of using like chariots and partially forcing their way in, partially synthesizing their culture with peoples sort of kind of already there, the Dravidians. I don't know. I have to have some fun with this once in a while, so I apologize. The political organization and economy of the Aryans after settling in India deserves our attention for a few moments here. As L.S. Stavriano says in a very famous textbook on world history, the shift to agriculture stimulated various crafts necessary for the new villages, including carpentry, metallurgy, weaving, and tanning. Agriculture also promoted trade, with the river serving as natural highways for transporting surplus food. When coins appeared, the earliest weight standards, significantly enough, were exactly those of the pre-Aryan Indus civilization. So there does appear to have been a connection there. Towns grew out of villages that were strategically located for trade or that had specialized particular crafts. Going on to say, this economic growth, this economic growth of wealth, in turn facilitated political consolidation. Originally, Indo-Aryans organized under tribal chiefs, but eventually the tribes gave way to kingdoms, and eventually kind of even beyond that. So this is the kind of the starting point, the gateway to what would become these pretty large kingdoms, although never one uniting all of India. By the way, the subcontinent of India is gigantic. Even on maps and various projections on globes, the Mercator projection, they never can quite get India right. And they always end up making it, or almost always end up making it too small. So when you see it on a globe and a map, it's actually probably bigger than that in reality. So it's a gigantic piece of real estate. We're now moving on to culture, more specifically, and the origins of religion in India. And this takes us to the Vedas and Sanskrit. Quote from the Rig Veda: "We have recourse, Indra, god of war, to thee for protection at sacred rites." So saying they're talking about rituals that they do to basically praying for protection and support from the god Indra, so they'll be successful in warfare. The this sort of group of people, the Dravidians, again intermarried with the Indo-European Aryans, which became the Indian people more or less in time. They had a tradition of oral history, mainly through poems and songs, passed down, for hundreds and hundreds, thousands of years possibly, that eventually got written down. They survived because they got memorized and passed down from father to son, generation to generation. And so it was an oral tradition for a long time. It wasn't in writing, and they had a formal language, but it wasn't written at the time, known as Sanskrit. And Sanskrit does survive to the into the time when it gets written down, but it was a more formal language, not a normal spoken language. The second language you see there, Prakrit, is a less formal one, which is the language that eventually evolved into kind of everyday spoken Hindi, Bengali, and other languages. So Sanskrit was never really a useful language, or one that was put to use for the practical day-to-day necessities of living. But so Sanskrit was kind of more like Latin in Europe. Latin was always in the Roman Empire, Latin was a living language, but after that it survived, but was mainly the language of scholarship, language of the Catholic Church that oftentimes nobody understood except for the priests or other priests in the church or cathedral. So Sanskrit is that kind of a formal language. The Vedas were the earliest known poetic works in Sanskrit. Again, first passed down through oral tradition, but hymns, prayers, songs, rituals honoring not just Indra, the god of war, but numerous gods. There are actually 4 Vedas, but what's known as the Rig Veda is the most important, and the one that gets, I think deservedly so, all the attention today. 1,028 poems that survive, hymns to gods, compiled by anonymous, or people we don't know. They weren't anonymous at the time necessarily, but we don't know their names. Priests between the dates roughly that you see there. As William McNeill, maybe the most famous practitioner and scholar of world history ever, in a book called World History, or A World History, says the Vedas, used as handbooks of religious ritual, consist of songs that were recited aloud during sacrifices. A great deal of effort was made to preserve details of accent and pronunciation by insisting on exact memorization of text from master to pupil across the generations. Every jot and tittle of the inherited, I don't know what jot and tittle means, every little detail, of the inherited verses was felt to matter. Some Brahmins began to, those are the priests, major religious figures, some Brahmins began to argue that by performing rituals correctly, they could actually compel the gods to grant what was asked of them. So they really got into making sure, or they thought it was critical, that they do the rituals extremely precisely. For if you did them wrong, their belief was that the gods might not accept it and might not help you. If you did them right, the gods were apt to give you what you wanted. There are other religions around the world that have a similar feature to them. This might be the most famous one, however. James McClellan, in a fascinating book on science and technology in world history, and I include this just to give us a sense of how important all these sort of cultural texts and writings were, even beyond just culture and religion. Given the centrality of the sacred Sanskrit texts, he says, and the magical power of the oral recitation, linguistics and grammatical studies became the first sciences to develop in India. The Sanskrit language and the Vedas formed the basis of all study, and many grammatical and linguistic guides were produced to lead novices and experts through their intricacies. The importance of oral recitation, it's late at night, the importance of oral recitation of the Vedic scriptures likewise led to traditional studies of acoustics and analyses of musical tones. So these sacred texts were pored over and thought of as so important that it led to the study of them in all kinds of different ways, but it's sort of like you have like a whole university with multiple subjects all built around studying kind of one book. But it shows you, I think, some of the power in this, and that religions and traditional religious texts often have incredibly important functions. They always do in cultures and societies, and they almost always have them even beyond just the religion itself. The religion itself is important usually to the cohesiveness and the workings of society, but as you can see here in that last quote, its importance goes even beyond that. Religion is always fantastic social glue, as I've said before. The Vedas in Aryan religion in the Vedic era, meaning the Veda era, the war god Indra, we've already talked about. There were gods for the sun, the moon, the sky, health. The god Varuna showed ethical concerns. Again, all kinds of ritual sacrifices done. These are the types of rituals and rites that they felt they had to get absolutely right down to a T. Bentley, our author, I wish I had a Bentley, says, although the Aryans accorded high respect to Indra and his military leadership, their religion did not neglect ethics. They believed that the god Varuna presided over the sky from his heavenly palace, where he oversaw the behavior of the mortals and preserved the cosmic order. Varuna and his helpers despised lying and evil deeds of all sorts, and they afflicted malefactors with severe punishments. They dispatched the souls of evildoers to the subterranean house of clay, a dreary and miserable realm of punishment, while allowing souls of the virtuous to enter the Aryan heaven known as the world of the fathers. So this is a religion in some ways, or it's on its way to being a religion in some ways, that's somewhat unique. I mean, it's unique in a lot of other ways we haven't gotten to yet. When we come back to India in later centuries, millennia, we'll talk about those too. But in the sense that they put so much emphasis on ethics, and there's kind of a concept of heaven and hell, this resembles Christianity, Judaism, the monotheistic religions of the West, though this is still polytheism, multiple gods, and just the fact that there's so much concern about ethics. We'll see a lot of places, and we already have, in Egypt, Mesopotamia, for instance, the Greeks and the Romans, we'll see the same thing, where the gods were not about ethics. In fact, the gods themselves didn't engage in ethical behavior, and the Greek gods were notorious for all kinds of shenanigans and what we call sinfulness, in monotheistic religions. So this is somewhat of a new and interesting and important development. The beginnings of the caste system. You might know something about this already. It's one of the, if not the most famous thing about early India. But the Indo-Aryans, when they first came to India, had possessed a simple social structure with three classes: warrior nobles, priests, and common people. So that clearly was an influence, because it's still kind of in this, but a lot of complications are added. In some ways, in a lot of ways, complexities that are hard to understand unless you really spend like a lifetime studying this. So I'm giving you a very simplified version of the origins of the caste system. The culture during the Vedic era by this time had 4 hereditary castes, the Varnas, as they were known. Varna basically translates to color, by the way, which has led scholars to believe, probably correctly, that the caste system, at least at first, had something to do with skin pigmentation, and whether lighter or darker colored skin was what you or your family had. We'll maybe more on that in another lecture. There were subcastes as well, people that were considered not part of, below the caste system. So the 4 castes, as they came down to us: the Brahmins, we've already met; the priests, the Kshatriyas, warrior nobles, Vaishyas, landowners, merchants, Shudras, the bottom, peasants, servants, commoners. But actually, at the very bottom was a group that isn't even included in the caste system, the untouchables or outcasts. Often people that did stuff for a living that nobody wanted to have to do or be around. Latrine cleaners, right? Toilet cleaners. Okay, they're untouchables. But this then was a class system, but it was more than a class system. That's why we call it a caste system. There's class within it, meaning there's hierarchy of classes. Some classes are wealthier, more powerful, and have more legal, cultural, customary privileges. But as Michael Mann says, caste is what anthropologists call a segmentary as well as a hierarchical system. It relates together groups and activities that are merely different from, not superior to, one another, while at the same time also has sort of the hierarchical differences where some people in one class are considered superior to another that are considered inferior. So the segmentary part of it means there are some castes that are separate, oftentimes by profession, by trade, not always, that aren't necessarily better or worse. They're just a different group, and they sort of have camaraderie and sort of their own subculture and customs in some ways. So that is kind of grafted onto a more traditional class system by which people are sort of ranked as far as their social and economic, political importance is concerned. The caste system it certainly wasn't a ladder for social mobility, but as our textbook tells us, it wasn't. These things weren't locked in stone all the time. There were sometimes people that could move from one class sort of up the ladder. You could move laterally too if you changed jobs, I suppose. But moving up wasn't impossible. But this isn't. It isn't a real recipe for social mobility. It happened, but it certainly wasn't designed for this. The Law Book of Manu and the development of patriarchal society. So this is a fairly well-known development as well. The writer of this is anonymous, but the person wrote a work that he attributed to Manu, the founder of life in Indian mythology. You see a modern, or at least modern world, copy of the Laws of Manu by Manu. That makes sense. Although, again, it wasn't written by Manu. It was written by somebody else that called himself Manu. Much of the book, not all of it, is about gender relations. But as Professor Bentley says, it dealt with also proper moral behavior and social relationships, including sex and gender relationships. The law book reflected the society constructed under Aryan influence. The author advised men to treat women with honor and respect, but he insisted that women remain subject to the guidance of the principal men in their lives. First their fathers, then their husbands, and finally, if they survive their husbands, even their sons. It also specified that the most important duties of women were to bear children and maintain wholesome homes for their families. So, this is a very traditional approach or belief system with regard to relationships between men and women. But of course, it's not that much different, or if different at all, in other parts of the world that we've been or will go to, other time periods that we'll go to. So this kind of belief about women supposed to be subjected to men, was around for a long time and was merely ubiquitous. Not as a good thing, of course, but this is the ancient world, so humans had a lot to learn about how to treat each other. The significance of the Upanishads and its teachings. This is sort of our next step in the history of Indian religion. The Upanishads are really kind of the original texts of what comes to be known as Hinduism later on. They're written in Sanskrit, at least the original. What you see on the right is a copy in English, which I read. I don't read Sanskrit. If everybody's ever heard of J. Robert Oppenheimer. This is totally off script. The father of the atomic bomb, brilliant Berkeley physicist, and a physicist, but he was good at everything. Every subject he was good at. And he'd read these kind of books. He got interested in all kinds of world's religions, and he read the Upanishads in the original Sanskrit. I'm going to have discussions with scholars of Sanskrit, sometimes in Sanskrit, about these texts. An astounding figure, a brain. It's just hard to believe how bright, how smart J. Robert Oppenheimer was. Again, that's an aside. The one recent text says, during the middle of the first millennium BCE, some thinkers, mostly Brahmin ascetics living in forests, Brahmin are the priests, ascetics, what's that, ascetic? The word ascetic and aesthetic are close. This is ascetic, and it means living with few possessions and little concern for possessions. So, kind of like a monk. So mostly Brahmin monks living in forests, right? Monks usually live places that are out of the way of civilization, or at least city life. They're kind of secluded. Forests wouldn't be my choice, but okay. So these are mostly religious priests, intellectuals, who felt the Vedic rituals, the old traditional religion, no longer provided satisfactory answers to the many questions of a rapidly changing society. The result was a collection of works known as the Upanishads, or the Supreme Knowledge, translated more or less, which expanded the Vedic cultural system. So this group of priests believe that the Vedic rituals and earlier religion had worked for a long time, but it didn't seem to speak to the modern world. I mean, their modern world, the current world that they were living in. So they decided they needed to expand and change. So the Upanishads are philosophical, spiritual dialogues between a fictional sage, kind of teacher, wise man, and his disciples. They offered insightful thinking on what the perfect social order should look like. So all kinds of talk about how societies function, cultures function, how they should, what works, what doesn't work. So in some ways it's practical, philosophical dialogue and knowledge, but it's also sort of striving for truth and understanding about sort of the bigger metaphysical, religious questions in the universe as well. It taught that people are not separate, but united in a cosmic universe. It's called Brahma. Further, that the physical world is always in flux and chaos and illusion. You can't really sort of pen the real word down. You can't ever really figure it out. But the eternal being, Atman, gives everyone, eternal life. So that souls are reborn and transmigrate into new lives, which of course is what? I can hear you saying it, karma. So this is the origins of karma, which of course becomes a key feature of Hindu religion, kind of the next step, or not too many steps away. So at the top, I said these are the original texts of what becomes Hinduism. Here we see maybe the premier example of it. At that time, in that part of India, then religion, this new religion that's going to become Hinduism in not too long, became the unifying bond for all of society. So it wasn't true in every part of India, but this particular religious belief system that traveled well and eventually expanded sort of did the same thing for much of India later on that it did for just this one region. Remember, religion, if it's an attractive religion to the people in that area, it's great social glue. I'm not saying that's its only use and function. It's certainly not. But it is great social glue. From the Upanishads themselves, an invisible and subtle essence is the spirit of the whole universe. That is reality. That is truth. Thou art that. And with that, I bid you good evening.